So now we're finally coming to the point where we'll discuss methods for approaching writing your own counterpoint examples. Really the very first thing you should do when starting to write a counterpoint example is to do a very thorough analysis of the canis firmus against which you will be writing. So that entails taking a look at the direction of the melodic line, the contour, especially the climax, and skips and leaps. So the different directions, the overall melodic contour and skips and leaps. So here I've done an analysis of the canis firmus from the error detection we were looking at a minute ago. The horizontal lines, or diagonal, indicate the direction of different segments of the melody. The vertical lines indicate sort of two melodic climaxes. It's kind of a stepwise or wave-like melodic climax in this, so there's two worth noting. And then the brackets indicate places where there are skips in the melody. So armed with all of this knowledge, we can start to think about how we're going to set our counterpoint against that. We'll look for a place to put the counterpoint's melodic climax, someplace different than the canis firmus, and also think about ways to contrast and nicely weave our melody into the melody shown. So I've written three counterpoints to this cantus firmus. They might be perfect, they might be okay, they might have some mistakes. I want you to take a second to look at each of them and try to determine your own analysis. Is it a good example? So pause the screen now for a second and take a look at this first one, sing through it, play through it, and see if you see any errors or anything you like. And we'll look at the next one in a moment. So before we take a look at the next one, I want to talk quickly about some of the ways I approached writing this one. The first thing I did was I started at the end. You know more or less, certainly you know the last two measures of what you need to write. So from there, it's pretty easy to work on the measure or two before those last couple of measures. So that's what I did here. I tried to make some nice contrary motion against the canis firmus, which is in the lower voice, so I wrote the upper voice. I then looked for a place for a melodic climax that was different than when the canis firmus had its climax. You can see the canis firmus climaxes on the A, kind of in the middle, and the counterpoint climaxes on the D in the bar before. Finally, I thought about the beginning, and since I'm writing my counterpoint above, I had a little bit more options. I could have started on a C, on a fifth, but I chose, in fact, to start on the octave. So here's the whole thing again in all its glory. Take a minute to sing through it and see what you think about it. And momentarily, we'll look at a couple of other examples. So here's another example. This one takes a pretty different approach. Pause it for a second, sing through it, and see what you think. Be sure to critique as you see fit. And the final one, this was actually the first one I wrote. And take a minute to pause it and sing through it and see what you think about the example. So here they are together, a bit small, but I guess, what do you think? Which one is the best? Why? Uh, what's wrong with the other ones? I'm very curious to hear what you think. So pause it now if you don't want to know my opinion yet. In general, um, I think that this first example is pretty decent. Um, you'll note that there's a good bit of parallel motion within this, though it's all permitted, but that's probably my strongest criticism of this particular exercise. That and the climaxes are kind of close together. Well, if you count that first melodic climax of the Canis Firmus rather than the second, which is much later on. So the second example does have an error, or two, depending on how strict you're being. However, I actually really kind of like this example because if you look at the Canis Firmus, the shape of the Canis Firmus, it's this gradually ascending line, but then it has a dip, and then it ascends again, and then descends. So it's ascending with these two sort of key points. And the Canis Firmus, the counterpoint, is doing the exact opposite in reverse. It begins with this leap and then descends for a little while, leaps up again, and then descends. So I really kind of love that interplay between the two lines. The error, of course, is the outlining of the tritone. There's also an octave followed by a fifth, which isn't great, but isn't completely wrong either. It's just a guideline. So the one example that I don't like is the last one here, which was actually the first one that I wrote. Based on the rules we've discussed, there's not actually technically anything wrong with this example. It follows all of the rules, and you can see there's a bunch of contrary motion, stepwise motion, all of those good things. But if you look at the counterpoint, the top line, it noodles around the same notes the entire time, basically. There's no shape to it whatsoever. It's incredibly dull. So even though it's not technically incorrect, I think this is in some ways the worst of the three examples, even worse than the one with the mistake, in my opinion. So finally, the plan was for the day that you would write your own counterpoint to this Canis Firmus. So if you have the time, I suggest trying that out.